At 6:12 on a freezing January morning in 1945, Private First Class Arthur Hale pressed his cheek against the splintered edge of a collapsed barn wall outside the village of Waldhambeck. The forest beyond was choked with fog so dense it seemed alive, rolling in slow waves across the snow. He was 23, tense, exhausted, and down to a squad that had lost 7 men in just 11 days. The pattern never changed. The Germans struck first, struck fast, and vanished before anyone managed to reload or reposition. Hale steadied the rifle in his hands, a weapon the army had rejected, dismissed, and sent to storage yards. A rifle most officers considered cheap, unstable, and unfit for line infantry. Yet he held it tighter than anything standard issue had ever given him. I'm Berg, and if stories like these matter to you, subscribe to Firepower World War II so we can bring forgotten battlefield truths back into the light. The 79th Infantry Division had been grinding forward through Alsace, where the winter tore at exposed faces and froze rifle oil into sludge. Lines stretched thin after the chaos of the Bulge, and the enemy's counterattacks came with a precision that made veterans whisper. Hale's platoon had orders to hold the approaches to Waldhambeck, a cluster of stone houses now half sunk under snowdrifts. He was a rifleman with a simple mission on paper: detect movement, hold flanks, and prevent German scouts from slipping into marked targets for larger pushes. Simple in theory, brutal in practice. Their section's main weakness wasn't courage or discipline, it was time. Time lost to reloading, shifting positions, and waiting for a teammate to cover what couldn't be covered quickly enough. The Germans exploited that window with uncanny speed. They initiated contact first in 8 out of 10 engagements. A snap volley, a burst from a concealed MG-42, a single sniper round that froze a man mid-breath, always before Hale's squad settled into firing rhythm. Every time the line of Garand cycled dry, there was a moment of helplessness while clips were slapped in, bolts released, eyes flicking desperately for movement. The enemy knew that moment. They hunted for it. And they claimed lives in it. Hale kept replaying the last week in his mind. The loss that hit hardest was Corporal Joe Ramirez, the carpenter from El Paso who carved animals from ration crates and stuck them in his helmet band for luck. Ramirez had been kneeling behind a fallen pine, firing steady shots into a ravine. Then his rifle chimed empty. He ducked back, reached for a new clip, and never got it seated. A German squad surged up the slope in those 2 seconds, firing blind into the tree-line. When the smoke cleared, Ramirez lay on his side with his hand still gripping the fresh clip, as if refusing to let go of the life he'd been denied the chance to save. 2 days later came Private Leon Porter. Iowa farm boy, crack shot, quiet, thoughtful. He could read wind through branches the way other men read newspaper columns. They were moving along a frozen ditch, Porter on overwatch. Hale remembered the crunch of brittle snow as Porter shifted to cover a bend. A Garand ping echoed, the unmistakable sound of a clip ejecting. Porter froze. In the next heartbeat he tried to duck back and reload. That was when the sniper fired. Hale had dropped to his knees immediately, pressing himself into the cold bank, but Porter never moved again. He had done everything right. The pattern killed him, not his mistake. For Hale, the grief settled into something sharper than sorrow. A pressure behind the ribs that grew with every patrol. He kept wondering, how do you fight when the enemy always fires first? How do you defend a line when your rifle demands silence and stillness to reload, but the enemy demands speed? How do you keep men alive when your weapon requires more time than your enemy is willing to give? Technically, he understood the issue. The M1 Garand was powerful, reliable, and beloved by most of the army, but its end-block clip design meant once you fired through 8 rounds, you were locked into a full reload. No topping off. No partial feed. And the metallic ping of the empty clip told anyone listening exactly when you were vulnerable. Doctrine demanded the squad rotate reloads, cover each other, and maintain momentum, but snow, terrain, and surprise attacks made doctrine a distant luxury. The Germans weren't meeting them in clean fields. They struck from behind rocks, from shadows, from half-buried machine gun nests. And every time a garand went dry, the fight tilted against them. Hale felt trapped inside a tactical equation with no solution. Until the day he found something that shouldn't have mattered. It was lying in a corner of a half-collapsed shack, tossed among broken crates and captured equipment. A rifle, odd profile, long receiver, distinctive rotating bolt handle, caked in mud and half-frozen grease. A tag marked it as material recovered from Marine raiders months prior. Not standard issue. Not approved for infantry. Barely respected by anyone outside the small units that swore by it. The M1941 Johnson. He had heard stories. Marines who liked it because you could reload at any time, dropping extra rounds into the side port. Raiders who praised its mild recoil and smooth cycling when climbing through jungle terrain. But to the Army? It had been too fragile, too cheaply built, too unpredictable. And yet, holding it in the dim light, Hale felt something shift. Not hope, just possibility. A small, stupid possibility. It was unauthorized. He knew that. Carrying it into combat could mean punishment, even court-martial. But what was the alternative? Watch another friend die in the same predictable pattern. Leave another man exposed in the seconds his rifle fell silent? That night, Hale slipped away to the attic of a ruined barn, where moonlight broke through gaps in the roof and dust drifted in slow motion. He laid the Johnson across the floorboards, stripped it down, and scraped mud from its rotating bolt. Tools were scarce. He used his pocket knife to clear grime from the feed ramp, a length of wire from a shattered wagon wheel to stabilize the fore end, and a strip of tape from medical supplies to keep the handguard from rattling. His hands shook every time the floorboards creaked, terrified someone would climb up and catch him with contraband weaponry. The first reassembly failed. The bolt stuck halfway. The second jammed worse. The third attempt sounded like the whole attic might collapse when a loose spring snapped across the floor. Hale froze, breath locked in his chest. No footsteps came. He waited until the cold numbed his fingers again, then tried once more. On the fourth attempt, the action slid clean. The magazine accepted rounds effortlessly. And when he tilted the rifle to test the feed, the cartridges settled perfectly into the rotating drum. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't standard. But it worked. He chambered a round, kept the rifle pointed at a crack beam, and pressed the trigger. Just a mechanical click, no firing pin, no powder. Enough to tell him that the cycle ran true. Enough to show him exactly what would have saved Ramirez. What would have given Porter one more step to duck behind cover. If uncovering forgotten battlefield ingenuity keeps you here, hit subscribe so we can keep rescuing these buried stories. 3 days later, before dawn, the first chance to test the rifle came. A patrol of 5 men moved along a narrow ravine carved between 2 snow-laden hills. Visibility was almost zero. Frost clung to helmet rims like crystal. The squad advanced slowly, Hale positioned near the front, the Johnson resting lightly in his hands. It felt foreign compared to the reassuring weight of a garand, but he trusted it now in a way he no longer trusted the old pattern. A sudden burst of MG-42 fire shattered the stillness. The muzzle flashes were barely visible through the fog, but the tearing roar identified the range instantly, close enough to shred the patrol if they stalled. Hale dropped behind a fallen log, hard hammering. The 2 men beside him returned fire, but the old problem returned, their garands emptied almost simultaneously. Hale heard the telltale pings cutting through the chaos. The Germans surged forward, repeating the same deadly rhythm as every other ambush. Hale didn't wait. He fired 2 shots, rolled to the next stump, topped off the Johnson with 3 quick rounds, and fired again without pause. He could stay mobile. He could stay loud. He could stay alive. Through the fog, he spotted 2 silhouettes flanking left, men no one else had seen yet. Hale braced the rifle, steadied his breath, and fired. The nearest figure dropped instantly. The second dove for cover but exposed himself a second too long. Hale's next shot into the push. The ravine fell quiet except for the echo of distant retreating boots. The patrol was shaken, but alive. Hale stared at the rifle in his hands, realizing the line had been broken, not by luck, but by a choice the rulebook never would have allowed. He didn't know it yet, but this morning was only the beginning. Word traveled faster than Hale expected. By the time they returned to their makeshift command post that afternoon, 2 sergeants had already heard that the kid with the strange rifle had kept the patrol alive during a textbook German ambush. Nobody asked questions openly, not yet, but men glanced at the weapon slung over his shoulder as if it carried a rumor instead of ammunition. In a war where small advantages felt like lifelines, curiosity spread through the platoon with an urgency born of desperation. It started quietly. A private approached Hale while he cleaned the rifle behind a damaged farm cart. He asked to hold it. "Just 1 shot," he said. "Just to feel the balance." Within minutes a second man appeared. Then a third. They weren't searching for novelty, they were searching for survival. Hale handed it over cautiously, watching the way their eyes widened at the ease of the reload, the smoothness of the cycling bolt. Word reached a squad 2 houses down. They arrived with questions, some with disbelief, others with the silent hope that maybe, for once, the battlefield gods could be challenged. By the next morning, 2 more Johnson rifles were unearthed from storage. Nobody remembered who had pulled them out or how they had arrived there. No one asked. All that mattered was the practicality. The men stripped the rifles down, comparing parts, trading spare springs and pins, testing actions with the reverence of mechanics restoring an abandoned truck. Hale spent hours explaining the rotating bolt, the side-loading magazine, the way you could replenish rounds at any time. The men listened with the seriousness normally reserved for briefings from a captain. Their company commander noticed the sudden interest but was too overwhelmed with reorganizing defenses to intervene. The Germans were probing every mile of the line, attacking in waves designed to exhaust the defenders. Every few hours a fresh push came, sometimes small, sometimes violent, always unpredictable. Snow, smoke, and fatigue blurred the days together. What the commander did notice, though, was that Hale's squad survived confrontations others didn't. That they had stopped losing men at the same rate. That they were responding faster, repositioning during reloads instead of freezing. He didn't know why. But he wasn't about to question it. The Germans sensed the shift too. Their initial shock at meeting return fire so quickly gave way to adaptation. They changed angles. They attacked from shallow gullies instead of ridgelines. They staggered their machine gun bursts to bait reloads. But every time they thought they had found the opening, Hale or one of the men using a Johnson fired again from a position they hadn't predicted. What should have been a 10-second reload window shrank to 2 or 3 seconds of partial topping off while the shooter moved laterally. Each time a German squad leader tried to seize the initiative, his forward scouts were met by unexpected, sustained pressure. The statistics told the clearest story. Before the first Johnson appeared in the line, the platoon averaged 3 casualties per significant engagement. By the end of the week, after 14 men had rotated through the 2 available Johnsons, the casualty number dropped to 0. Not diminished, 0. Something that felt impossible on this stretch of the front. But success drew attention. One cold afternoon, as Hale wiped ice from the rifle's receiver, he turned to see Captain Mallory standing behind him. The captain was known for fairness but also for absolute adherence to regulation. He eyed the Johnson with a neutrality that felt more dangerous than anger. "Where did you get that?" Mallory asked. Hale swallowed. He could lie. But the truth was simpler. "Recovered from storage, sir." "Who authorized its use?" "No one." Hale forced himself to hold eye contact. "But it saved the squad, sir." Mallory motioned for the rifle. Hale handed it over. The captain inspected it, turning it in his hands, testing the bolt, examining the feed port. He wasn't ignorant of the weapon's history. He knew it had failed adoption trials. He knew the Army had considered it too fragile. He knew what carrying unauthorized equipment meant under military law. Then he glanced at the men around them. 4 soldiers stood nearby, silent but unafraid to let their hope show. They knew what this moment meant too. Mallory lowered the rifle. "This weapon never entered my field of view," he said quietly. "Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." He handed the rifle back. As he walked away, he added, "You keep your men alive, Hale. If anyone asks, you tell them I approved increased flexibility." That flexibility became the unofficial doctrine of their corner of walled handbook. Night after night, Hale found himself refining the Johnson. He filed a nick feed lip with the edge of a bayonet. He reinforced a loose rear sight with a sliver of wood from a broken crate. A medic gave him extra surgical tape to keep snow out of the action. None of these adjustments were proper or sanctioned, but every small modification counted. The rifle moved from strange novelty to lifeline. Then came the push that defined everything. It was just after first light when German artillery walked shells across the tree line, bracketing the American positions with cruel precision. Snow erupted into clouds of dirt and ice. Trees splintered and toppled. Hale and his squad hunkered down in the ruins of a stone farmhouse, bracing for the inevitable infantry wave. They knew the drill: artillery softened the front, then assault teams surged forward to exploit the chaos. Through the drifting smoke, Hale glimpsed movement, 24 silhouettes tightening formation behind a ridgeline. More followed. Then more. A full company strength, at least. Maybe more. The kind of push that could collapse their position entirely if left unchecked. The farmhouse wall shook as another shell landed nearby. The air stank of cordite and dust. Hale's squad exchanged tense glances. The Garand gunners braced themselves. They could hold for a minute, maybe 2, before needing to reload. And if the Germans kept pressure high enough, those reload windows would be death sentences. Hale steadied the Johnson against the windowsill. He could hear his heartbeat drowning out the muffled artillery. As the first German assault team broke over the ridge, he fired. 3 shots. Rolled left behind a fallen beam. Topped off the rifle in 3 seconds. Fired again. The Germans staggered, confused. Normally they expected breaks in American fire. Now there were none. Hale moved like a man who had rehearsed every motion 100 times in his mind: fire, shift, top off, fire. The squad followed his pace. With Hale disrupting the forward momentum, the others managed to stagger their reloads and maintain a continuous front of resistance. Even when the MG-42 came online from the ridge, Hale's shots forced the gunner to pivot awkwardly. A second Johnson user, Private Desmond, joined from the right flank, sending controlled fire into the advancing troops. The assault faltered. Germans dropped behind cover, then tried to rush again, only to be cut off by another string of fire from Hale and Desmond. The attackers had expected panic. They had expected reload pauses. They had expected the American line to crack. Instead, they found themselves pinned by 2 rifles the Army had officially written off. The pressure broke. The German formation dissolved, retreating back over the ridge in fractured groups. The attack, one that should have overrun the farmhouse in minutes, failed before it even reached the outer wall. When silence finally fell, Hale sank against the shattered stones, chest heaving. The men looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. They had survived a push from nearly 300 enemy soldiers. And when command tallied the numbers later, they discovered that Hale's platoon had suffered only minor injuries. No deaths. Not one. In the following days, more Johnsons appeared in the line, their origins unclear, their arrival unannounced. Soldiers swapped tips, cleaned the rifles together, improvised fixes. What began as one man's desperate experiment became a quiet, unofficial revolution. And soon, higher command noticed that a small American position in the freezing forests of Alsace had withstood attacks that should have erased it from the map. Rumors drifted upward through the chain of command, as they always did, stripped of context and swollen with speculation. Reports spoke of a platoon that refused to break, of a sector that absorbed repeated German assaults without suffering the expected losses. Officers wanted explanations. Inspectors wanted confirmation. And eventually a colonel arrived at the farmhouse where Hale's platoon operated, accompanied by a clipboard, a radio operator, and an expression that made men stand straighter. The colonel performed his inspection with cold efficiency, moving from weapon to weapon. When he reached Hale, he paused. The Johnson slung over Hale's shoulder looked out of place among the standard-issue Garins. The colonel extended his hand. Hale surrendered the rifle without meeting his eyes. The older officer examined it meticulously. He scraped a thin line of frost from the receiver with a thumbnail, checked the rotating bolt, tested the magazine's loading gate. His brow barely moved. Finally he asked, calmly but firmly, "Who authorized this weapon in my regiment?" Nobody spoke. The silence felt like a held breath shared by 30 men. Hale forced himself to answer. "No authorization, sir." A long moment passed. "But it kept your men alive?" the colonel asked, without looking up. "Yes, sir. Casualty reports reflect that." He handed the rifle back. "The paperwork will say I reprimanded you. The official log will say this weapon is non-standard and removed from service." Then his tone softened, barely. "The battlefield, however, will say something else entirely." He turned and walked away, noting on his clipboard that Hale's platoon should receive increased ammunition resupply and wider discretion in equipment handling. Nothing more. Nothing less. But it was enough. Enough to let the Johnson rifles remain in service without further interference. Enough to validate, quietly, what the men had already known: the field had its own laws, and sometimes those laws were written in whatever kept soldiers breathing. The war dragged through its final months. Snow gave way to mud, the mud gave way to thaw, and the forests of Alsace shifted from frozen tombs to fields of ruin. Hale fought through each transition with the same methodical steadiness. He refined the Johnson's quirks until he could clear a jam blindfolded. He taught younger replacements how to replenish rounds without losing a second of mobility. He kept a careful watch over the men who looked to him not as a hero but as a reminder that survival was possible. By late war, Hale had earned a reputation among his division as the rifleman who never seemed to stop firing. Men joked that his weapon must have had a hidden drum feeding it, not understanding that the secret wasn't ammunition capacity, it was the absence of forced pauses. He didn't announce what he had done. He didn't need to. The results told the story. When the fighting finally ended, Hale boarded a troop ship home with a few mementos in his duffel bag: a watch Ramirez had given him to fix but never picked up, a sketch Porter had started of the farmhouse they defended, and a single spent Johnson casing he had kept from the morning they stopped 300 Germans cold. He didn't talk about the rifle. He didn't tell neighbors he had changed the fate of a platoon by breaking regulations. He simply started working in a mechanic shop in Minnesota, fixing engines and listening to the quiet hum of machines that, unlike rifles, had no opinion about who lived or died. Every January 14th, he called Ramirez's mother. They talked about nothing important, weather, church, small-town gossip. She never asked for details about how her son died. Hale never offered them. But she always said the same sentence before hanging up: "I'm glad someone remembers him." For years, the story of the Johnson rifles in Waldhambeck lived only in the minds of the men who fought there. Many passed away without ever telling their families what really happened. Others spoke vaguely of a strange rifle that seemed to work better than it should have. No official report ever mentioned Hale. No citation ever noted the innovation. The Army had long since moved on. Then, in 1991, a military historian sorting through maintenance backlog stumbled upon a curious footnote: non-standard rifle in field. Rotating bolt. No serial record. The historian traced the note to Waldhambeck, then to the 79th Division, and finally to surviving veterans. Interviews followed. Old men sat in sunlit living rooms, describing the sound of the Johnson cycling bolt. A widow in Ohio wept quietly when she learned why her husband's squad had survived a push that should have crushed them. She said she always felt he had been saved by something he never had the words for. Now she understood. The historian wrote a paper, short, technical, barely noticed, about the anomalous presence of the Johnson rifle in late-war American lines. It appeared in an obscure journal with a circulation smaller than a rural phone book. Yet for the few who read it, especially families of the men who fought there, it meant everything. And today, in a quiet museum corner, one of the surviving Johnson rifles sits behind glass. The plaque beneath it tells a half-truth: M1941 Johnson Rifle. Limited use. Rejected for general adoption. It doesn't mention Hale. It doesn't mention the farmhouse. It doesn't mention the morning that 2 rifles helped stop 300 Germans and saved an entire platoon. But the real legacy doesn't need a plaque. The real legacy lives in the men who came home because one soldier refused to accept a broken pattern. It lives in the small defiance of a rulebook that forgot the battlefield is written by those who bleed on it. It lives in the idea that sometimes innovation is not a grand invention. It is a quiet decision made by a young man who simply cannot stand to lose another friend. Most people have never heard Arthur Hale's name. Now you have. If this story moved you, help keep it alive. Like the video so the algorithm doesn't bury it. Subscribe to join the community of people who protect forgotten stories from disappearing. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because every memory preserved across borders is another way of honoring the men who never told their stories themselves.